Welcome to our Conversations with Experts. I'm Mandeep, your host and the co-founder of Bendi. We're a risk intelligence software for organizations with complex supply chains and a focus on textile and apparel. Apparel and textile supply chains are extremely complex. A single item can pass through hundreds of hands and suppliers to get to us. This means there's a huge amount of uncertainty. How were people treated? What are the environmental impacts? What can companies understand about their supply chain partners better and work with them to protect people, planet, and profit? Today, we're focusing on the supplier perspective. I have two esteemed guests with me today. Firstly, Ilishio Lovejoy, who's an ESG specialist with over 10 years experience working with and through businesses to address social and environmental impacts of global supply chain practices, with roles within NGOs, academia, brands, and suppliers. She's currently the general manager of sustainability at Simple Approach, a multinational apparel supplier where she's focused on capacity building, integrating due diligence practices, measurement, and reporting. She was previously the manager of the research and policy team at Fashion Revolution, where she worked on industry benchmarking through the now very famous Fashion Transparency Index and EU-level policy and research advocacy. Ilishio, welcome.
Hi.
Great. And I also have Dr. Divya Jyoti. She's a scholar and practitioner in sustainability. Her work draws on attention to experiences of people in complex supply chains, mapping multiple geographies in the fashion industry. She's worked with textile industry for over a decade in various capacities in organizations like the Center for Responsible Business in India, working with governments, fashion brands, retailers, and their suppliers on the challenges of ethical trade. She's currently a lecturer at Lancaster University in the UK. She's a member of the Certification Committee of Goodweave and an honorary director of Justice in Fashion in the UK, where she's working with the garment industry in Leicester. Dr. Divya Jyoti, a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, and pleasure to be here. Looking forward.
Great. So really looking forward to hearing you both speak and share your experiences a bit more. I'd love to start with you, Ilishio.
Hi, so I think you covered it. For the past year and a half, I have been working within a supplier, multinational one, predominantly based in Bangladesh. It was quite a step change from my previous career, which was mainly around research within NGOs, partnering with academia and with brands. So I took this role within the supply chain to really understand change from a supplier perspective. I think they're the key in change and often left quite widely out of the conversation. So I can't claim to know everything, having only been with them a year and a half, but I've certainly learned a lot. And I've got a small presentation which I can talk you guys through to talk about some of the biggest risks that I see from this perspective with multiple hats on. So if we go to the next slide. I think it's important to start with, it's a very hard question actually, because globalized supply chains pose many risks. There are a huge amount of risks, and it really depends on whether you're looking at this from a micro or macro level. And for instance, there are a number of different human rights risks that we could have a whole webinar on each one individually. So I just want to emphasize this before I move on, that the risks I talk about today do not belittle many of the other risks that I will not mention. And of course, human rights risks and environmental risks are prevalent. There are many of them, and we could go through that. But what I actually wanted to look at is some of the kind of more macro, maybe, well, these play out on micro and macro levels, risks that I think are fundamental to achieving progress across the rest of the human rights and environmental risks in the supply chain. So that's why I'm not mentioning them specifically. I've chosen these 5 things because I think they will help us tackle the rest of the risks that we see. So I'm going to speak very briefly on legislation, opposing objectives, relationships, transparency, and capacity building. We can go to the next slide. So first of all, I wanted to raise, I think legislation for any brand and increasingly suppliers in the fashion and textile space, legislation is probably one of your highest risks at the moment. It's on everybody's agenda. It's developing unprecedented laws and regulations for our industry, which many people are struggling to keep up with the development of those and respond to them. I think a huge risk that I'm seeing there is the fact that the supplier has largely been left out of the conversation whilst developing those legislative proposals and policies. And I'm speaking predominantly across the US, Canada, the EU, and the UK. The risk that this poses is that when the supplier is left out of the conversation, as I mentioned at the beginning, they're kind of what I would call the implementer of this change. And if the implementer is left out of the conversation, they will not be aware of these legislations and they will not really know how to comply at all. So it's in everybody's interest, policymakers and brands, that you engage suppliers from the beginning, not only because you can shape a policy that will actually be implementable, that will hopefully move towards the goals of that policy more sufficiently, but also because in that process, it means that the supplier is aware and will be prepared to comply with the policies, which is ultimately our aim across that. So I will move on to the next slide. I could say a lot more on these, but I know that we're going to go into conversation afterwards. So just to give brief highlights. Another thing that I find apparent is opposing objectives. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's a plethora of different risks and opportunities across the supply chain. And I think sometimes we can focus on one and then another without seeing or acknowledging the opposing pushes and pulls that they create. So for instance, a huge one, which everybody brings up, but I have to bring it up as a huge risk, is that price sensitivity. The price of raw materials is increasing. The economic system and political changes that are happening globally at the moment are further affecting supply chains and prices. Throughout COVID, there have been massive economic issues, supply chain issues, shipping industry issues. All of this is really, really impacting the price of product. But at the same time, legislation, brands, and consumers are pushing for, and rightly so, better materials, improved working conditions, improved facilities, environmental responses, things like living wages. But it's really at conflict with other key strategies such as price and how we approach them. So I just think I'm using this one clear example, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, but I see it play out a lot. To give you another example, we're looking at circularity and what circular products means. On one aspect of that is that we will try to use recycled fibers to bring a circular product back into a loop. Another part of circularity is longevity. So when we try to implement this with the team, with the people that actually do the work, they've raised a really important conflict that recycled fibers don't tend to have the same staple length and strength that virgin materials have. So within the same piece of work, we're trying to both lengthen the life cycle of this garment, have it last longer through more washes, have someone be able to wear it for longer and pass it down for longer. But we also want to use recycled fibers back in that process to bring a circular product, which may actually impact on the longevity of that. So I hope that kind of illustrates there are a number of opposing objectives, and I'm just highlighting two there, but I think it's an area we are not yet focusing on. So we can go on to the next slide. Relationships. Again, I had to bring this up. I think it's absolutely key. I think the word itself is now being used more widely, but I think it's a bit of lip service from what I hear and see. So we have to be careful that sometimes when we think that a risk or an opportunity is on an agenda, it's really about that follow through too, and what that really means in practice. Again, I'll just say briefly, I think I don't need to press on this because we'll all agree that relationships are fundamental for change across anything and everything. If you don't have the relationships, you're really not going to be able to implement strategies of any kind at all. They're fundamentally important at every level of the supply chain for transparency and everything else. It's something that we're trying to work more on. It's really hard and complex. It crosses cultural barriers and many, many other things, but it's a super important place. So I wanted to mention it today. And we can go on to the next slide. I want to bring up transparency, and I'm sure, again, this is not a new concept for any of us, but what I think is important and you're not yet being addressed is the two-way transparency. We are asking for what we would call top-down transparency, which is great and it's really necessary. And I've spent a large amount of my career working towards that and pushing the industry towards transparency. You know, it's a saying that we said at Fashion Revolution many times, but you can't fix what you can't see. It's of absolute importance that you understand your supply chain and it enables you to respond to risks and opportunities within it. But what we are not yet seeing is transparency in two directions. So you could say from the bottom up, or you could just even that out and there is no top and bottom, that it's transparency in multiple directions. Because I think this also, as I've put here, it uncovers risks from both sides. As COVID showed many suppliers, there were huge financial risks associated with which customers you were with, and those risks resulted in workers not being able to be paid. There are fundamental reasons that two-way transparency will help improve supply chains. I think, again, it supports due diligence. And most importantly, I think, is it builds trust. So if you really want to know how your supply chain is performing, you should be open and willing to share how you are also performing and what your strategies and plans are. In that way, you can all have more honest and more even conversations about the way forward. And coming back to my previous slide, it builds better relationships. If you ask and ask and ask of somebody, but you're not giving equally in return, it's not going to create an equitable relationship, I would say. So I will move on. I'm whizzing through all of these. I also wanted to touch on capacity building, and that is something that has been coming up for me a lot in my position within the supply chain now. I think when I was in the NGO space, the conversation would oftentimes be that suppliers are not willing, that they don't understand the need for this change, that they don't want to change, and how do we incentivize suppliers to change? How do we get them on board? And I am seeing largely, this is not always the case, but I'm seeing largely that they are willing and they are already on board. But sometimes the know-how is not there or the resources are not there. And actually, I think the biggest thing that my takeaway of the last year and a half has taught me is that capacity building is needed. Again, we are working across multiple cultures. Strategies are communicated differently and oftentimes not communicated, as I brought up with the legislation. It's not that companies may be unwilling to comply, but they may not know it's being developed and may not understand how to comply. So it's starting with a strategy, but it's capacity building with your suppliers and their suppliers on how do you do this. If you want transparency, it's not just about asking for it, it's about talking to them about how do you currently do this? How can we support you with methods and processes to do this work? It allows suppliers to deliver for brands, for legislators, but it also allows them to better deliver for their employees, for their workers, and for the environment. In capacity building, I see it as a win for everybody involved. But funny enough, I don't see it being focused on as much as requirements and strategies and goals. But it's really the follow through part for me. I think we can move on to the next slide, which is my final slide for today. And I just wanted to remind that whilst we are talking about risks, everywhere that there is a risk, there is an opportunity. So I think that focusing on your risk can be a great and a very positive thing to do, because it will uncover opportunities for you to develop your supply chain, which will ultimately improve for everybody involved. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
That was, I mean, any of those topics, thank you, Ilishio. Any single one of those topics, we could have spoken for another hour at least, right? That's almost an entire term's worth of learning that you've squeezed into those slides. I have too many questions to ask in such a short space of time, but I wanted to follow up on a couple of things, just in terms of, so a couple of points. Firstly, just on one of your last slides, really appreciate and agree with this whole thing of, yes, identifying risks is the first step, but really there is an opportunity. And you talked about the positive opportunities on the backs of kind of challenges and issues that already exist. Capacity building felt like a good place to start. What kinds of capacity building have you seen that's worked well? Is it sort of training? Is it something else? Curious to hear.
Yeah, I think there is a push and a pull within the industry. Data often requires us to look at large, like brushstrokes of suppliers. We're trying to understand top line stuff, but I'd say when it comes to capacity building, that it's about the minute and the contextual. So it's really about understanding, and this is a process that we're going through with our own suppliers, understanding their unique offering, where they're at on their sustainability journey, and how do we support that. So it can be anything, to be honest, from we have within the company, we've given loans at certain points to our suppliers to help them to make a change where they want to. We do deliver training. Training's a great way, but again, training's only so good as it gets implemented. So it's, if you're going to deliver a training, can you follow up with that? Can you be on support there to support them? It's about knowledge sharing, I think. It's about, what else have we done? I think it can be about bringing the right expertise in as well, you know, identifying areas of need, whether that's in HR issues, gender issues, carbon, water quality. It's about identifying where there is a lack of knowledge and bringing the expertise in to kind of support and handhold, I'd say, through that process. For instance, with waste collection for circularity, we have recently engaged with a partnership, and they're coaching us, but they're also coaching our suppliers through the process. And they also have a tech tool which enables us to sell that and to record that. So they're really hand-holding, you could say, the whole supply chain, and giving us all transparency through the process as well.
But yeah, amazing set of examples, especially kind of the idea of lending, because it sort of touches on your point around pricing. You know, you can't have the same price and want more. It's like, I need you to do more. I need people to have X, Y, Z, but the price needs to stay the same. So it's not possible. So really, really good example to hear about that. One other question, actually, and this one I've been thinking about a lot myself already. really around all these new regulations that come in, lots around forced labor, human rights due diligence, everything from the US to Europe. So it was interesting to hear you speak about how suppliers haven't been engaged. You know, it's the same kind of, it's corporate social responsibility, it's top down, in effect, somewhat, you know, our ivory houses sitting in their ivory towers and making rules that affect people, but those people are the ones that have to really enact them. And I think is there an opportunity there to do something differently? I've certainly heard of a couple of examples of worker engaged or worker kind of coordinated development of, they haven't turned into laws, but it's certainly programs. So I'd love to hear kind of an example of something that we could do better on that.
Yeah, I think it's really about when we look at stakeholder engagement, which I think we have got a lot better at doing in recent years, but it's then not only saying we've engaged stakeholders, but which stakeholders have we engaged, and do they represent the key players that are going to enable the success of this or not? As I said, it then also offers as a capacity building opportunity, because if you engage someone in the creation of something, they're much more likely to understand what that is and to implement it. But I think there have been years of calling for legislation, and legislation is needed, but it can also be potentially damaging if that legislation is not thought through and is rushed through. And I think the coming years will show us how that plays out. For instance, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US, at the moment, that is, I think it's there to enable transparency and better collaboration throughout your supply chain. But because it's got such severe consequences, there is not necessarily collaborative approach that I'm hearing about so much as everybody trying to legally protect themselves. So let's review contracts, let's review policies, let's make sure that the onus has been passed down. So yeah, it's really, if you involve everybody in a room to begin with and say, how's this going to play out? Maybe you get to better outcomes. But that being said, it's a challenge, and you have to start somewhere, and it has to keep improving. But I do think that better stakeholder engagement will really, really benefit the development of better policies, but also the implementation of them.
Yeah, 100%. And really interesting to hear you speak about the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act in particular, because of course, anti-slavery laws are incredibly important, but when perhaps the outcomes of not actually being able to comply with them quickly enough are so severe, you can really put pressures on suppliers, on companies, and the outcomes can be quite obtuse, not the things that we would imagine. And so it can be quite worrying, but of course it's a good thing. Super, super great to hear all of that. I'd love to pass to you, Dr. Jyoti, and hear about your perspective.
Thank you so much. And yes, very, very interesting. Maybe what I'll do, so I do not have slides, but I'll just start with a brief intro to myself, which will hopefully, clarify my position of entering this conversation. And then I'll pick on some of the things you've discussed. So first of all, just to say that I started as a student in the fashion industry, and as a young, student in my early 20s, kind of got disillusioned at the very onset, when I was working in green rooms of, I would say, fashion shows that we were organizing, and stumbled upon, shall I say, with this idea of CSR sustainability, because at the time in India, it was not really spoken about in the way, we are now seeing these issues, I would say 10, 15 years later, becoming far more prominent. And that started me on a journey where the global conversation in some ways was looking at capacity building in supply chain. So it's interesting that, the risk that you highlighted, Ilishio, it's really the starting point at which I entered the space, because I started working with an organization known as the German Development Corporation, which is like the DFID here in the UK, just to place that into context. And they were, their premise was that we can deal with all of these challenges that we are facing if we improve the capacity of suppliers. So it's a question of capability and technical capacity, knowledge, rather than anything else. And that's what I spent nearly 5 decades working on the ground with this organization, Center for Responsible Business, and began to see the some of the limits of it, which we can perhaps tease out in the latter part. But really, it was this question of what you just alluded to, the top-down approach, be it the legislation or even the private approaches, which came from the companies or multi-stakeholder initiatives, which made me curious about the supplier perspective, on all of it. So that's where I started understanding and reflecting on these issues, and wanted to do a master's on sustainability, social responsibility. And during that reflection, I actually realized that it's not just the suppliers, but also the workers, who we tend to refer to as a, almost an abstract category, when they are really the one on which the entire industry is really built on, in some ways, which led me to my PhD, where I examined and spent a couple of months in factories looking at the experiences of workers, and eventually decided to stay with academia, but have some foot in within the practice industry. So currently I'm involved in the work in Leicester, where we are working as a part of Justice and Fashion. We've actually been able to finally mobilize suppliers together in some way, and we played a crucial role in the back end, supporting the apparel textile manufacturers federation, which is perhaps the first of its kind in the region, which brings together the voices of the local suppliers who've been, as you said, painted almost as the villains in the entire challenge of the supply chain. And yes, we've had exposés. The situation in Leicester is not really new. We've known about it in various ways. There have been previous reports, but COVID kind of blew the problem in the face. And because Boo was involved in such a big way, there's been a lot of attention which has been drawn in. So that's what I'm currently working on. Just before I share some of the thoughts on some of the ideas and questions that you pose to us, I just want to say that I'm going to be a bit provocative, and some of my views might come across as strong, not always politically correct, but that's why I moved to academia. So that's really my, I would say, justification for it, or excuse for it, because I want to draw attention to the different issues and challenges that I have noticed, and that in my previous, day jobs, I could neither analyze or, I would say, draw attention to. And while I may at some points, come across maybe asking too big questions or maybe too critical, the idea is that we encourage conversations to help think about these challenges. So coming to, I would say, the risks and what are perhaps the biggest risk, I completely agree with what Ilishio has highlighted. But I think the biggest one, perhaps, if you think about from a buyer's perspective, could arguably be this whole entire issue of working conditions, and from there the impact on people as well as the planet. Now, in a way, if you kind of go back and reflect on it, offshoring or outsourcing rose to prominence with the idea of reducing cost, but there was also a rationale of transferring, a range of operational risks and uncertainties, including the whole employment relations aspect of it. It was supposed to be another firm's problem. As the lead company, we could just specialize in what we did best. And those who were the advocates of, I should say, business model innovation, they insisted on competitive advantage, slicing of operations, specializations, and all of this was shaped and was shaping, the narrative around the gift of globalization. And let's look at the globe as our factory and as our market. what we are facing now in some ways are the limits of those ideas in some ways. And just to add a point there, that it's not just international, the slicing or outsourcing can be next door as well. And that's what we've kind of seen in the case of Leicester as well. So it isn't really about, that it's just the global north or the global south, as has been often discussed. And a lot of assumptions have been, and the whole idea of top down in some ways also has had a geographic, I would say, connotation to it, but it is more the power imbalance between actors, the way we have set up, I would say, these supply chains. And just to, I would say, complement some of the issues in practice which have just been highlighted, I would just want to add that when we're talking about risks, I mean, the way I see it is that risks are always situated, and they are connected to, actors' activities, what is being carried out. So if you kind of look at risks and, almost like lift them out of social context as if they are out there, that becomes almost problematic. And I think in a lot of our conversations around risk and risk management and risk minimization, that's what we are tending to do. What is required is, and that's what I feel, is to remember that these risks are being constantly generated by our behaviors and actions. They are not just out there. It is we are as much as an actor in it. And if we are to be conscious of our operations, of our decisions in some ways, then maybe it will become much more easier to tackle it. And therefore, I kind of wholeheartedly agree with Ilishio about the engagement aspect of it. Because if we undertake an exercise which is holistic, be it, you're talking about legislation or the environmental issues, or, but if you were to sit down with your supplier and think about knowing the product, what goes into making it from different aspects, the material side of it, the operational side of it, the people side of it, perhaps if you think about it from an impact aspect, then what eventually become risks could almost be preempted in some ways. I am conscious that as I say this, we may feel a bit overwhelmed with the magnanimity of the challenge and perhaps the approach. But if you think about these issues, they are known as grand challenges or wicked problems. In some ways, we've made it so, but that's why we are here. So we have to, I would say, balance between the big picture conversation and then, teasing out these details. And often what I've noticed in my work with suppliers, and also in these conversations that I've had with different suppliers, as a part of my research and also otherwise, is we often just kind of get stuck with these, and I'm using the term stuck very consciously, but no judgments there, with the detailing of addressing, one small issue and almost gloss over, the bigger challenge or where it's coming from. And in some ways, the issue of price within this industry is a real big one. And how do you really change the narrative? And something which is very specific to this industry is that it is known for, setting up the ideals for what people want. We talk about fashion, right? And that influence is so potent. So if we start thinking about it from that point of view, we can almost, I would say, just change the entire conversation. So yes, there are bits around, what we can potentially do, how do we enable meaningful participation. But just one final point, as to how I see we can possibly address these risks, and which is a more overarching one, is really to humanize the supply chains. We need to really stop, looking at suppliers as one name on the Excel sheet, and having certain statistics from where X number of garments are going to be landing up on our table, but rather getting to know the suppliers and the workers, the context and the country. I always suggest that go and visit the workers where they live. Don't go to those supply countries just as a tourist, but really to try and understand the perspective, their lives, their challenges, Also, because I think what we need a lot is empathy, and that is something I'm happy to tease out, more, because that's something which emerged again and again in my work, particularly in the last 5 years, where for a lot of suppliers, it's almost, and the term we use within academia sometimes is that this has all become a form of imperialism, which has just come top down, and they're just supposed to do it, take it, or it's my way or the highway kind of approach, which becomes really, really challenging. And it's not because a particular firm is problematic, or a particular actor is problematic. There are no judgments. I think it's just the nature of the relationship that have come together. There have been different kinds of I should say, arguments put forward. So some have said, as you said, that, oh, they do not have the capacity. But some have also almost said that, oh, they're trying to, evade all of this stuff because they just, that's the approach and that's the tactic. But I think the question to ask is why, would an evasion to even a code of conduct really happen? Why is it that you are compelled to hide the actual practices? What are those behaviors which are triggering that action? And that's what I mean by thinking about, humanizing the supply chains and being conscious that risks are being generated in our interactions, and we are almost often increasing our challenge with respect to risks as we think about it. So those are just some opening remarks, but happy to delve deeper and offer some crazy, if I can label it so, approaches to possibly tackling them.
That was a fascinating journey through the depths of your mind, I must say, and your experiences. So thank you for taking us through that. I've got a couple of points I'd really like to touch on. I guess we talked a little bit, or I mentioned even this sort of global north, or neo-imperialism, as you called it, on the global south. But then you also work with factories in Leicester, which you said you worked with them before COVID, so before all this sort of boohoo stuff carried on. And of course, they're not in the global south; they're in the global north. So it's almost like there is a group of people who make the rules, and then everyone else. And some of them, certainly I've heard of it. They might be workers in Latino workers in a factory in Florida, or they might be migrant workers in a factory in Leicester. It's sort of, they have some things in common. It's like they're not engaged. There's something going on. There's a top-down approach. I wondered if, do you think it is a north-south issue, or is it actually it's more around hierarchy and control and power and cross globally?
So first, just to clarify, so JIF started working, it was during the pandemic, actually, when the news reports started coming out about garment workers globally, that JIF was formed. So that was really the motivation of the team setting up the organization. And we started working in Leicester after the expose. So, none of us had really worked in the space before. And I was at the time working in, a university in Leicester. And that's where I met Jen, who is now the managing director. So just to kind of put that into context, we were not engaging in it before, but I can share that when I first learned about the issues in Leicester, it was during my master's when I had come to the UK in 2014. And in 2015, there was a report which came out. And I was really intrigued, because the whole picture which had been often, and which is often painted, as you said, that it is a north-south issue. That's how it is presented. And that's where I began to realize that it's not so much about the global north and the global south in the sense of geographies. It's more, as you say, this relationship of, where the decisions are being made and taken, and the power. It's a question of power. And that's where I think this manifests. To some extent, we are living in a global world. Any product you pick up comes across from, I don't know, we can't even, I would say it would be very hard to pinpoint where all in the world it has been, if you were to really tear apart a piece of garment or break open, one of our phones or devices. I think everything is really gone global in that sense. So I do not necessarily think, while the idea is often posited as that, I think it's not just a global north-south thing. It's a question of power. And that has become even more stark and prominent with the latest expose with Shein, if you have noticed that, because it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be, it's a brand, and we, the consumers, I mean, emerging market multinationals and brands have been a phenomena that we have been talking about for a while, and Shein just highlights the problems of the principles within the industry, which is the logic of fast fashion. It doesn't have to be a brand which is based geographically anywhere and suppliers based anywhere, because we are living in a global world in very many ways. But to kind of bracket that, I think in coping with these challenges, geopolitics does play a huge role. But that's more of a, I would say, an IR reflection, so we can't go there. We're talking about suppliers. But I think in tackling those issues, geography will end up playing more role. And we have seen that, I would say, more broadly, globally, in whatever's been happening with the Trump in the US, UK leaving EU, and some of those issues, or the whole position India and China took in the COP26 discussions. But yeah.
So we've actually, it's been, I mean, we're coming to the kind of the end of our talk already, which I can't believe, but there's just been so much in there. I don't want to leave I don't want to end this until perhaps we could sort of end on a slightly more, we've gone through the depths of, what are the risks? What are the worst case scenarios? Here are some examples of things that really are the wicked problems, are so incredibly hard to deal with. But perhaps if I could ask you both to think of, some examples of where you've seen things gone really well across any of those risk bases that we've discussed. I'd love to pass that to you, Ilishio. You gave some great examples of capacity building, but perhaps there's some others.
I think just because I wanted to circle back to those points, I'm going to use that as where I've seen it gone really well. But I think that Divya pointed out something that I had touched on as well, and it's this, you said contextual, and really getting to know those suppliers. And when we talked about training as well, it's not the training, it's that follow through and hand-holding or walking together. It's spending time and really these issues, as we said, we could have a webinar on any single one of these issues because they're huge, they're complex, and they're interlinked. So they're evolving and changing as the other issues do. And you could really spend a significant amount of time on each of them. And I think what we do out of pressure at every level of this is we try to do a little bit on all of them. And we're not really getting very far because of that. So I just wanted to highlight that it's that contextual, and it's something that I'm trying to implement within our company, but that I have seen be more successful is when you sit down and you build a genuine relationship and you know that you and your supplier are in this for the long term together, and you understand what it is they do, how they operate, what their weak points are, what their strengths are, and they understand yours. That's when you can really find opportunities for change and where you can find your biggest risks as well and respond to those, or not let them become risks. But that's extremely complex to do, and I'm not seeing it done a lot. If you're talking about multi-country brand or retailer, they have hundreds of suppliers at their tier 1 level. I'm not underestimating where to get started on that, but I do think that it will really bring some incredible results. It is a worry, as Divya mentioned as well, that you feel like you're doing a bit of micro work when we need to be seeing shifts on the macro. But I think that it's ultimately all of those small actions, and people, it's not small, it's big actions, really difficult actions. Even within one supply chain, it can take you a year to get a project off the ground. But it's that leads into inspiration and acknowledgement for someone else to do it. And I guess I'm ending on a risk a bit more. The risk is that we're not doing it fast enough. But that contextual approach, I believe, will really see the biggest shifts for us. So I hope I answered them.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that you've got hundreds of suppliers, even in your tier one. I mean, look, we work in the software space, so we're trying to help automate a bunch of those things, but really it can't just be an automated process. It has to be something that's hand in hand with understanding the specific context of your suppliers as well, if you want to bring about kind of long-term change that you've built together effectively. Divya.
I might just, sorry, if I can just
Yeah,
add
please.
one thing there. I also don't want to say that this is only about individual and contextual work, because we are operating within systems and structures which put real pressures on individual companies and peoples and their decisions. And living wage is a perfect example of that. You know, can we just start paying a living wage in one factory? No, it's not going to work. It has to be tackled systemically, because you're going to create a multitude of other problems in doing that. And when you're a brand and you only work with a quarter of those workers in that factory, you can't pay a quarter of the workers in a factory a living wage. You have to collaborate at a systemic level. So I just want to say that I'm not underestimating how difficult that is. And it's about operating and working on both of those planes at the same time, contributing to systemic shifts so that we enable reviewed and improved systems in which we can work and do that contextual and deeper work, I think. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks, Ilishio. So I'll just build on from there, and I will do two things. I'll one give an example, but then I'll also kind of perhaps close with some invitations to some crazy ideas which we can possibly explore. So I think the key really, as you said, is collaboration. There is a need for almost a parallel working around individual action, but then also systemic intervention. And I think the challenge really becomes, how do you do both? How do you balance? And that goes for any organization. I mean, just talking about JIF, that's one question, that we're doing all of this meaningful engagement, running advice clinics for workers on the ground, working with suppliers, but then we know the challenges within the bigger industry, and how do you really tackle those pressures? And the same goes, I think, for brands as well as suppliers. But that is where I think collaboration could be a useful tool. And some things which I've seen, I think the impact time will reveal, but some brands have really taken a collaborative approach. And one I know is, where the brand and the supplier kind of came together, developed a whole tool for worker voice to understand workers' perspectives, and almost piloted it in one factory and then scaled it up to different factories, which is making some difference. It of course can't challenge everything, but such kinds of innovative collaborations would be useful. And taking an example in a similar way in the automotive industry, just if we can draw an example, that they were trying to do a social life cycle assessment jointly with the buyer and the supplier. And that's what I mean, that if you think about these collaborative approaches, and you look at your supplier as a partner in the true sense, that you are almost doing a joint analysis of risk, rather than these are my risks and this is your headache to almost handle and cope with, then perhaps you redefine the boundary within which you're looking at risks. And I think that kind of just leaves me with one thought around this meaningful supplier engagement, and what does that look like? Most brands have a practice of doing these supplier days or stakeholder days, where they invite their suppliers, which is often becomes like a one-way transmission of information and celebration of some bits. How do you make it more meaningful? How do you create those spaces where suppliers feel confident enough and safe enough to raise questions? Because one thing which has happened, and that just goes back to the issue of transparency, is in the name of transparency, and this is suppliers' perspective, which I'm just resonating here, a lot of information has been sought. And then that information is used to further squeeze you down to bring down prices. That just complicates the whole situation, and no wonder we see a tick box kind of exercise happening. So I mean, I don't know if there are ways we can handle it, but one little idea which comes to me, and it comes to me from the point of my current role, because I engage with this young generation. I really feel that, you know, it is the people within the companies who are talking about these risks, who know a lot, and we do not adequately optimize and capitalize, I would say, on their knowledge. So maybe one idea could be to carry out, you know, thought experiments with the different teams within these companies, and to try and develop, you know, approaches within for meaningful action, rather than just co-opting the existing ongoing narrative, which, you know, tends to be that, oh, this is competitive advantage, so let's just, you know, go for that. And maybe that is where we can unpack, unravel, understand more deeply some of these issues. So it's really about doing thought experiments as teams, as industry groups, you know, as different stakeholders, to see what are the possibilities which we can potentially carve out. I don't think there are solutions out there, which is why we are having these conversations. But there are, as Ilishio just illustrated, some efforts in that direction, and it's about putting our energy, resources to do more of that, and to do the less of you know, other side, and maybe mapping out this balance between this is what we are doing at a micro level, but this is where we need to be, you know, on a macro level, and doing, I would say, meaningful policy engagement as well, perhaps. But I mean, we can go on forever, so I'll just stop now because each of these in itself could be discussion worth of ours. But thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed, the reflections that you've given.
Incredibly rich conversation, and we could keep going for at least the rest of the day, if not several days, on any of the brilliant, I mean, it's been an incredibly informative session, so I can't thank you both enough, but really enjoyed hearing you speak and hearing that about the supplier perspective, which I think so often gets overlooked in our top-down discovery of risks. It's like, what do we think the risks are, rather than really hearing about, well, there's no silver bullet of what the answer is, but there are options, and certainly I've heard a lot of options today. So really, thank you so much, Dr. Jyoti, and thank you so much, Ilishio. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear from you, Jyoti, and to be involved in the conversation.
Great.
I always learn something.